ACC Nation football preview with our special guest, Tim Leonard, the pre- and post-game host and sideline reporter for Syracuse football. Tim, it's great to have you on board.
Good to be here with you guys. Excited to be talking some football. It means the season's getting closer and closer, and hopefully a good one for Syracuse in store.
Looking forward to it. Hey, it's often easy to forget that part of the dynamic nature of the Syracuse backfield was more than Sean Tucker, who now roams the NFL looking for points for Tampa Bay. The other part of that combination is an ACC quarterback that may not immediately come to mind of the casual college football fan, at least. But after looking at the numbers, I think most people will change their mind. So in order to get into a little more of this offense and talk to you about what's going on at Syracuse, I'm going to hand it over to Will and let him roll with some questions specifically geared toward the offense.
Yeah, so one of the big moves of the offseason is Robert and I has left to go down the Raleigh at NC State, and steps Jason Beck, who kind of his proteges followed him from Virginia to Syracuse and is sticking around. He does have a little bit of OC experience, not at the FBS level, but he does have it elsewhere. Do you expect there to be much of a change in offense still this year?
You know, not necessarily. I think everyone was pretty happy with what Robert and I was doing maybe at the start of the season. And then obviously Syracuse's season tailed off towards the end. Really the main critique with Robert and I, who spent just the 1 year with Syracuse last year, was kind of the same critique I think that Virginia fans had with the offense when he was there, is they didn't get the running back involved as much as I think Syracuse fans would have liked, especially when it was Sean Tucker and he was coming off what was such a great season and was, you know, on paper supposed to be one of the best running backs in the country going into next year. Tucker was not himself in terms of how healthy he was the year before, and I think that played a factor. So that'll be an interesting thing to monitor, because I think everyone was pretty happy with where Syracuse went from an offensive coordinator perspective 2 years ago with Sterling Gilbert to last year with Robert and I. And it seems like Jason Beck should be a guy that can fit right in and you know, follow in that tree that has been producing pretty good offensive seasons under that Anai Mendenhall tree. He feels like the next guy in line. But the question mark, I think, amongst fans is, will we see more of an emphasis on the run game compared to last year, going from Anai to Beck?
So we'll get to that in just a minute, but let's start with Garrett Schrader. Obviously had a strong start to the season and a strong ending, but in the middle he struggled a little bit. And maybe some of that was a little bit to injury. I know he did miss a game, but what's it going to take for him to be more consistent quarterback this year?
Yeah, with him, you know, we kind of know what we're getting at this point. He's not a perfect passer, although statistically he definitely improved, and makes sense going from kind of one full year as a starter 2 years ago to his second year this past year. His completion percentage and those type of numbers definitely went up. When you look at the advanced metrics on Pro Football Focus or those type of places, he was throwing the ball much better, much more accurately last season. But he's another guy that you could say was probably playing hurt, like you alluded to, towards the end of the season. And I think the tough part with him, and he did have off-season surgery here, missed all of the spring. So we'll see how that kind of impacts his sort of start of the season, if at all. But it feels like he's plays sort of a similar style, honestly, to another great Syracuse quarterback from recent years in Eric Dungy, where the question mark with him isn't so much of how good is Schrader going to be. We kind of know what we're getting. It's how long is he going to stay healthy, and how durable can he be with the style he's playing, because he is such a dual threat guy. He's reckless at times when he's running in the open field, and that's kind of the nature of what makes him a good quarterback, and also scares you a little bit as a fan or someone following the team, because, you know, injuries can happen when you're putting yourself on the line like that as a quarterback. But in terms of steps, I think everyone wants to see him just develop as a passer, and it felt like he did tweak some things in his mechanics throwing last year, and he saw some progress, especially in the early season.
And this is where it kind of gets interesting. And you mentioned he's a pretty good runner, but he also, you know, got banged up towards the end of the year, and you got to balance that out with, you know, you just lost one of the best running backs the program's had in Sean Tucker. So how does this running game just have this, you know, any sort of success this season?
Yeah, I will say I think LaQuint Allen is going to surprise some people. He's the new starter at running back, and he played in the bowl game when Sean Tucker sat out and put up some good numbers. It feels like it's kind of LaQuint Allen's backfield to take over. Juwan Price is also an option, a New Mexico State transfer who did not see much time last year. LaQuint is a guy that I think they will definitely utilize in the receiving game as well. And they tried to do a good amount of that with Tucker to some success and definitely had some screens and those type of plays set up in the offensive playbook. So I expect to see LaQuint putting up some pretty good numbers. The biggest question mark, really, when you talk about Syracuse on offense, and it's been this way for most of the Dino Babers era, it kind of falls back into what are we going to get from the offensive line and how productive is that front five going to be in terms of run blocking, pass protection has obviously been an issue. You go back a couple years ago, and Syracuse was one of the worst offensive lines, statistically speaking, throughout the season. And they still managed, honestly, decent numbers offensively for how much their quarterback was under pressure and how much their offensive line struggled. They brought in Mike Schmidt, who was an offensive line coach recently. He had some success, and now he has moved on to Mississippi State. So they've got some holes to fill, and there's a number of holes to fill on the coaching staff that we can get into, but it feels like offensive line is kind of that area that has been the quote unquote X factor or key for Syracuse for a number of years. And this year is no different, honestly.
Yeah, let's stay there because obviously there is some experience back, as you know, with a few starters back, and they obviously added through the portal a couple of potential starters. Is there reason to believe there could be an improvement this year up there?
I would say initially there's going to be some growing pains, I would think. There's guys that have come back. Chris Bleich is a guy who's been around college football for a while. Another one of those guys that just hasn't stayed healthy. He's an option on the interior part of the line. You mentioned they added some JUCO guys that I think will at least be in competition for spots. They added a center from Kentucky who should be probably their starting center, would be my best guess right now at how they'll line up at the beginning of the fall and going into the season. But it's a lot of new faces. And then you've got some young guys. Enrique Cruz was a highly rated recruit. Now he figures to maybe be a starter next season, but obviously you don't know exactly what you're going to get from a guy, even if he was a high 3-star recruit and one of their better recruits from a couple of seasons ago. So the offensive line, I think initially will struggle. I would be surprised if they hit the ground running right away, considering the amount of new faces they have to work in. Plus, it's a new offensive line coach as well. And, I don't think that's the worst thing in the world because Syracuse's schedule, a lot like last year when they got off to a good start, is a little softer in the beginning. And then when you get into ACC play and they have one stretch in particular in the middle of their schedule that is really tough, where they're playing Clemson at home, North Carolina on the road, and Florida State on the road in a 3-game stretch. And that figures to be in the middle of your season where it might be tough to get some wins. But hopefully by that point, the offensive line has worked through some growing pains.
We saw Rondé Gadsden the second have a breakout season. He's a big body guy who kind of is he's like a tight end in a receiver's body, just a really physical player, has a really good catch radius and all that stuff. But outside of that, there's still a lot of experience back there, right?
Yeah, the wide receiver group, I think, is one of the more exciting ones on paper. And honestly, like I touched on earlier with LaQuint Allen, I was going to say Damian Alford, a wide receiver option that I think will also be right up there. But LaQuint Allen, I touched on it earlier. I think from the outside, I've been looking at some of these positional rankings in Phil Steele's magazine or Athlon Sports or whatever. From an outsider's perspective, I feel like it's easy to just assume Syracuse is in a really tough spot running back wise because they lost Sean Tucker. But LaQuint Allen was one of their top recruits 2 seasons ago, did everything right last year, averaged about 6.5 yards per carry, was excellent when he got full time in the bowl game. So I think Syracuse is honestly internally very excited about what they have in LaQuint Allen. And if anything, the skill position groups of running back and wide receiver will be just as good as last year or better, and better than people are expecting. And Rondé Gadsden, he's the obvious best player on this team. If you were lining up this roster on the NCAA college football video game, I think he'd be the highest overall player. And I guess you might get a chance to do that next year when it comes back finally. But he's the guy that, statistically speaking, was excellent last year. And Syracuse definitely lost some key players, namely in the defensive secondary, to the transfer portal, which is going to happen in this day and age in college football when you're the level of a program that Syracuse is, and you have an opportunity to transfer and not have to sit out and everything. But Gadsden is the one guy that I think probably could have left, and the Orange are very, very happy that he stayed from a skill position perspective. He's going to be one of the better wide receivers in the ACC. So at least you have him back.
So we'll jump into defense here in just a moment, and also special teams in the schedule as well, which you've touched on just a little bit here and there. One question that I have, and I find this keeps coming up every year that we do interviews, we start finding out that teams are not getting the type of recognition from outside sources. The people who are covering sports in Syracuse, and maybe in a broader sense, maybe some of the in the state of New York, have a good grip on what's there and what's not there. But when you, like, say, jump to where I am, which is in Virginia, you're not getting the same information to these people, or they don't have the time or the effort or whatever. Here's what it comes down to that I keep finding is the standard is, and I want to ask you this question. This team, like most teams, do they have the experienced people who've been there for a few years, and the athletes who can step up and start filling roles? And we talk about somebody like Sean Tucker, and then it's like, oh, well, Sean's gone, so they don't have a running game anymore. Well, that's
Right.
the most ridiculous take I've ever heard in my life, because you have people who are stepping up who have been behind. Now, as it applies to the entire team, let's take this premise and just blanket over everybody. And this gives me a feel as to whether Dino is working on this and has been building this, and all of his coaching staff has been doing the same thing. Have they been bringing in people and establishing that next man up mentality that we find is what brings success to many college football teams?
I would say yes. And I think when you were talking there, it made me think about, in particular, in the Dino era, they've just had success at the offensive positions, the skill positions in particular, at finding that next guy. Wide receiver has always been a position, and some of it is the nature of the offense that Dino runs. It's not quite as no huddle and hurried pace as maybe Syracuse fans remember from 4 or 5 years ago. If anything, they've slowed down. And I think that's been a product of them not having quite the right pieces on the offensive line at times, and dealing with penalty issues on the line there and in the trenches. But I think the wide receiver position in particular has been pretty consistently next man up for Syracuse. The running back position, Sean Tucker, it's easy to forget, a couple years ago was not this huge recruit. And if we were doing a preview podcast like this in the middle of June before 2 seasons ago, Sean Tucker would have been mentioned as maybe the second or third back, and then he went bonkers and had a record-setting season for Syracuse. So I'm not saying LaQuint Allen is going to do that, but I think Syracuse has been able to, regardless of who they have, be pretty good at plugging and playing guys at the skill positions under Dino Babers, under that offense, no matter who the offensive coordinator really has been. So I don't think most Syracuse fans are as worried as the outsiders' vantage point might be on the skill positions this year. The concern is definitely more based on the offensive line. And then the other thing I'd add is, for Syracuse, it really has been a depth issue mostly for the last 3-4 years, or when they haven't had successful seasons. I was looking through the other day, and under Dino Babers in November regular season games, they are 6-20. So it's been a very similar script, honestly, to what we saw last year in a lot of seasons where they start out well and the schedule, which we'll get into, has some of that feel to it this year. The question mark is, can you actually keep producing when you do get into some inevitable injuries later on in the season? And I think that's where Syracuse has struggled. They've had injuries to their quarterback. They've had injuries to their linemen. They've had injuries at running back, Sean Tucker last year, and they just haven't had quite as many options in terms of 2 or 3 guys down the depth chart that are as good as some of the other ACC teams. And I think that has showed once they've gotten later into the season. But in terms of will guys be able to step up in the starting roles, that shouldn't be too much of a concern at the skill positions this season.
Okay. Yeah, and my apologies for that long-winded question, because that's my nature, to be long-winded. But got around to it and got a great answer. To be frank, watching Syracuse for the last 2 years, especially last year, was a very different and exciting feel watching that team. I felt like there was progression and that it was going in the right direction. And one of the things that I do notice on again, when we step back outside of the ACC, people tend to talk about the ACC football as something other than, and then it comes down to bowl play, and we find out that they're a little more than, and I just think that the ACC doesn't get the respect that it deserves, and this is an instance where I think Syracuse doesn't get enough eyes on from people who are writing about the conference to do them justice. That's my opinion. For what it's worth. So.
Well, I can tell you, you're preaching to the choir up here. I think there is a level of the Syracuse fan that feels like because they are pretty far away regionally from the rest of the conference as well, there's not as much attention in terms of all ACC teams in any sport, not just football, but it's tougher for people to have a good understanding of how good Syracuse is. And if you're maybe a North Carolina writer, you might just inevitably have a decent understanding of other teams because they're closer proximity, a Wake Forest or a Duke or whatever. Whether that's true, I don't know, but it's definitely something that fans can start saying as a rallying cry when the all ACC ballots don't go exactly according to plan.
Well, I tend to agree with that the point you just made. So we'll just leave it at that, because we could get into an entirely different program with that. Let's get into defense and talk about what's going on there, Tim. There's been changes. We've got a new coordinator, but the thing is, it's really not a new coordinator. It's sort of the old coordinator who taught the last coordinator. And it's an interesting scenario. So talk to us about what's going on there with, at least from that standpoint.
Yeah, Rocky Long is the new coordinator, and he's 73 years old. He's been coaching forever, and he coached Tony White, the old coordinator. Tony White was a linebacker of his. He taught him this defense, which is not used by many teams currently in college football, the 3-3-5 scheme that Syracuse has used. And Tony White was terrific. He has gone on to Nebraska to be the defensive coordinator for Matt Rule there. And it's kind of like how you feel about some of these players that have upgraded in the transfer portal. It's just going to happen when you're at Syracuse and it's not that much of a recruiting hotbed, and they haven't had a ton of success as a program post kind of Donovan McNabb in the 2000 era. So guys are going to move on. They're going to get paid more money. And you're right, Tony White moved on, but also the defense from an outsider's perspective and even from an insider's point of view won't look all that different this season, I think, because Rocky Long taught Tony White the defense that now he's going to use, and Syracuse is going to have the same scheme that they recruited guys to play in. So really similar to the offensive coordinator, where it is a new person, but is it really going to look all that different? Probably not. And I think that's the nice thing about Syracuse is on the surface, they lost a lot of coaches and they had a decent amount of turnover in terms of their high personnel in the transfer portal as well. They've added some good pieces in the transfer portal on defense too. And that's the give and the take in today's college football. But at least it's not like they're incorporating some entirely new system. And I think overall, everyone has been very pleased with how the 3-3-5 defense has looked. So if you're not getting Tony White back next year, maybe the next best thing is to have the guy that taught Tony White the defense.
So let's get into the Dirt Devils there on the line and talk about that aspect of what's going on with the defense. And then I'll let Will break down with you the rest of the defense.
Well, the defensive line, I think, is probably their best area. Well, I'd say linebackers, too, is right up there in terms of areas on the team overall at this point. I think you could point to quarterback, too, because they have a pretty deep quarterback room, and Garrett Schrader is back as an incumbent, which is good news. And you can't say that about a lot of other position groups. But defensive line wise, they maintained the same defensive line coach from last season, which is a plus. And that's not the case at all of these position groups that we'll get into. But they have Caleb Okechukwu, who's kind of the headliner there on the defensive edge rushing position. He's your sack guy on paper going into next year. They've got some interesting transfers, one from Alabama that I think people are eager to see just based on the pedigree that he had when he was a high school product. And it feels like Syracuse has done a decent job at getting back some pieces on the defense overall after losing the likes of Deuce Chestnut and some really key players. Jihad Carter to Ohio State, Deuce Chestnut to LSU are probably the two headliners that they lost. But defensive line as a whole, I think will be a positive for Syracuse. And I would say they're probably middle of the pack in the ACC in that position group.
Yeah, the linebackers look really, really good. Pro Football Focus released, I believe it was today, their highest graded linebackers, and Syracuse had two of them in Marlowe Wax and Anwar Sparrow. But at the same time, this is pretty solid. Like say, we got those two, but plus you get Stephon Thompson back, who missed pretty much the whole season. I think he got injured in the first game, and plus there's some depth in the coming from the portal. So this feels like this. Like you said, this is definitely one of the strengths of the team here.
Yeah, you lost Michael Jones, who's off pursuing a professional career, but Marlowe Wax was the biggest reaction, I would say, to a player coming back. There was some doubt if he would return, considering how the offseason was going. And you mentioned it's Pro Football Focus. Anytime I've ever looked at Pro Football Focus, he is always rated great. Even going back to when he was a freshman, he was hardly playing. He's a very sure-handed tackler. He's now the leader of your defense in the middle, and is a guy that brings a lot of experience to that position. Steph Thompson is more of a pass rusher from the weak side who can really create havoc. And Syracuse has done a very good job in this 3-3-5 scheme of producing turnovers. They've, statistically speaking, been right up there turnovers-wise for a number of years now under Dino Babers, and especially under this new defense. Some of that maybe is turnover luck. And when they had the great 2018 season, which feels like an eternity ago now, when they went 10-3 and went all the way to the Camping World Bowl, that was the year that led to Dino Babers getting a contract extension. That year in particular was their best turnover year in program history. And then the year after that, the turnover luck kind of went down. And that was one of the things that people pointed to as to why maybe that 10-3 season was a little more fluky than we realized at the time. But under this 3-3-5 scheme, they've done a great job at least causing some turnovers. And when you're a team that's less talented than some of the likes that you're going to play at Clemson, Florida State, North Carolina, even, I know Virginia Tech's struggling, but they've got blue chippers still, and Syracuse doesn't necessarily have that. So when you're trying to kind of flip the tables in some games, turnovers is a key. And Syracuse has won some games just strictly based on 3 or 4 turnovers in a game that have totally changed the tide.
This pass defense was one of the best in the ACC last season. I think they were ranked 3rd, and obviously, they suffered a big loss from last season. Garrett Williams is gone, but there's still some starters back. And then, again, they added some depth in the portal. So even though you lose, the leader of your secondary, this still seems like a pretty solid unit.
Yeah, I think the secondary has been a bright spot for Syracuse for a couple years in a row. And this year, it is definitely more of a question mark at this stage. Whether it just continues and they continue to produce good results in the secondary under this defense and it's more scheme than personnel, maybe we'll find out this year. They still have some incoming transfers that are intriguing, but I mean, last year, it's sort of silly to call Syracuse defensive back U or something like that, but I think there was a lot of optimism around how well Syracuse had done at recruiting the secondary positions in particular and how much success they had at translating those guys into NFL prospects. Andre Sisco's in the league now after being a turnover machine at Syracuse. And he was a guy that was recruited by Nick Monroe, who has since left the program. Trill Williams was a guy that was recruited by Nick Monroe, did really well and made some highlight reel plays for Syracuse in the secondary, went on to the NFL. Garrett Williams, you just mentioned, Nick Monroe guy, secondary guy. And Syracuse has really formed a nice pipeline, probably forgetting a couple, honestly, that have done well at Syracuse, exceeded expectations for their recruiting rankings, and gone on to do some nice things at the next level. So now you don't have Nick Monroe manning kind of that group, which is definitely more of a question mark. And you don't have as many, sure thing starters or known quantities in the backfield in the defensive secondary as we're used to. So the question there is, will it just sort of continue to be a steady progression of good secondary play and, if anything, improvement in that category from 4 or 5 years ago? Or will this be the year that they take a step back because their personnel has taken a step back?
Before we get into the schedule, and Jim will take to that here in a second, but one quick special teams question, because Andre Smith has been a very reliable kicker for 5 years, and now he has graduated and moved on. What's the replacement situation looking like there?
I'm guessing right now it'll be a Brady Denenberg as their kicker. They have a new punter entirely as well from Missouri, Jack Stonehouse, who has come over. And special teams was an area that Syracuse has struggled in. Maybe 2-3 years ago, it was a bigger problem than it was last year. Andre Schmidt had a sensational freshman year and won the Lou Groza Award for best kicker in the country. If anything, he sort of plateaued from that point, but he was still a very reliable kicker and one that, if you had an opportunity to win a game, you felt good about him going out there from the 40 to 50 yard range, which you can't say about a lot of teams in college football. So I think it'll be on paper a little bit of a step back, but they've got a good special teams coordinator now in Bill Lashevsky, who has done a nice job so far, has some NFL experience. And 2 or 3 years ago, Syracuse actually didn't have anyone on their special team side of things specifically geared at just coaching that unit. And that created some flack and also just led to some overall conversations of, the budget that Syracuse has and that type of stuff as to why they did not have that special team specific coordinator. They seem to have corrected that, or at least, added one there that has led to a little bit more success. And I will say too, Trevor Pena is a very solid returner who will be back from last year. So one of those little things that, you're not really going to see a ton when you're looking into Syracuse, but he can help you when you have a guy that's sure-handed back there and can make some nice plays too.
Go ahead, Jim.
A couple quick questions before we do get into the schedule, Tim. I'm kind of off track here a little bit. Again, that's my nature. NIL. You have any outstanding supporters that are stepping up to support the football team or players?
I think Syracuse is making strides in NIL. If anything, they might have been a little bit late to the game compared to others. But one thing I will say is the facilities are going to get a much needed facelift here soon. And from a recruiting perspective, that's, I think, been a very big missing piece for Syracuse. Their facilities were a little bit overdue for an upgrade. And I think compared to the Pittsburghs and the Rutgers and, other schools that they're fighting against, and even if you want to keep going, the Virginia Techs and the top teams in the ACC that are kind of fighting in that area as well, those facilities that Syracuse used to have were not up to par, but they just recently picked up a commitment for the 2024 class of a 4-star tight end who is in theory, I think, sort of persuaded by the idea of being the next Deronde Gadsden when he gets here. And, for other programs, 4 stars might be pretty customary. For Syracuse, that's a big get when they do pull in a 4-star. And reading through the quotes of why he picked Syracuse, he was quick to mention that he saw the designs of the new facilities and believed that that was a big reason why. So I think the facilities, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, definitely play a factor in what a high school kid views of the school and how much they're going to enjoy their time there. And I think Syracuse is making a facelift there, which should help them in recruiting down the road. In terms of NIL, I would say, if anything, they're sort of middle of the pack right now, but definitely working on getting more of an NIL base there. And I think that's the same for basketball as well. They feel like they're getting better in that area.
Well, you snatched the glory of my second question in your answer. So I was going to ask about facilities in moving forward. I think you aptly answered that for me. Let's get into the schedule here real quick. And as you alluded to, those first 4 games, I never like to say that anybody is a cupcake or a pushover. We know better, especially 2 of these teams are not. But Colgate, Western Michigan, Purdue, or actually 3, and Army could be wins. It will be challenging at Western Michigan. At Purdue, especially, Army is they're always going to give you a fight no matter what.
Yeah.
So, but that would be a great start for Syracuse, starting out 4-0.
I think if you're going to make a bowl game, you'd at least like to be 3-1 through that stretch. And for fans that don't quite remember and aren't as well versed on Syracuse that are tuning in, last year they started out and had a 6-0 start and everything was roses. And then they kind of hit the middle of the ACC stretch, lost 6 of their last 7 games, and ended up going 7-6 when you factor in the bowl game at the end there. But this schedule on paper, to me, sets up slightly easier. It's still the ACC. It's still tough. I think that Purdue game is sort of your litmus test game early on. And they played Purdue in a thrilling game in the Dome last year. And now they'll end this home-and-home series with them. That's going to be, I believe, a Saturday night game on NBC that will be kind of the first time for anyone to really see what Syracuse has truly got this season. And if they're going to be a factor, I think, nationally speaking, or if this is going to be a bowl team or not. And yeah, I think even though there are some maybe concerns about how quick this team could start, the schedule sort of plays into that pretty nicely for Syracuse. And to me, I mean, a successful season for them is if they make a bowl game or not. And I think in order to do that, they need to get off to a good start, because that's kind of where their schedule is a little softer.
Next lineup, the only thing I can say is this: Clemson, North Carolina, Florida State. Man, that's just killer's row right there. It's not as if you can't pull off a win, but that's really where you're going to earn it in a big way.
Yeah, and I mean, I think UNC will have a bounce back here. I think Florida State will obviously be right up there. So it depends on how you feel about those teams. But to me, that's about as tough of a 3-game stretch as you're going to get in the conference. Clemson, they are Clemson, but I think Syracuse has actually played them about as tough as any other school in the ACC, kind of in this heyday for Clemson, which whether that's on the decline or not, seriously, who knows? But it's at home where they've upset Clemson before, and it feels like whenever they play them, even last year, it was right down to the wire, and a couple penalties and a couple plays probably decided that game at Death Valley. So now they get them at home, and similar to kind of the Purdue game, that's one of those early games where you don't exactly know what you're getting yet from this sort of newer-ish team and new coordinators and all that. And that'll be an intriguing game and definitely a big crowd in the Dome, which is exciting. But I do think as you go further down the schedule, the ending of the schedule, and I talked about earlier how November has been the trouble spot for Syracuse because they've usually dealt with some injuries. And honestly, they've dealt with injuries at key positions. Quarterback, namely, has been a position where it feels like they cannot get through a season starting the same quarterback for all 12, 13 games, whatever it ends up being.
Right.
And, I think this November stretch compared to recent seasons for Syracuse on paper, it's early and we don't know exactly how these teams are going to line up in November, but I think this sets up as a little bit of an easier closing stretch than what we're used to, considering after the Florida State game, you play at Virginia Tech, a place you've won before, and obviously the Hokies aren't exactly at the peak of their powers recently. Boston College is at home. I think that's a game you'd expect to win, considering how we're evaluating the teams right now. Pittsburgh is technically a home game, but played at Yankee Stadium. Then you go at Georgia Tech and host Wake Forest to end the year. If you have a team that you feel like is better than you're expecting, I think you can definitely pick off some wins there. But that middle stretch, it's hard to see them not going 0-3 there in that stretch where you got Clemson, Florida State, and UNC.
Pretty brutal. And a good point there, indicating that the end of the season, it can go either direction for any of these teams, including Syracuse, because of injuries, because of improvements, because people begin to step up, multiple factors. So we'll see how everything goes there at the end of the season. But there is some potential. I've got a couple of question marks in 50-50s written beside a few of these games. So it has the potential, I think, of looking like a really good season in its entirety, except for those 3-game stretch is just brutal. I'm like, ugh, please.
Yeah. So maybe you're, 4-4 or 4-3, I guess would be more accurate coming out of that. And that's fine if it comes down to it like that. I think that Purdue game is another sort of 50-50 game, and you maybe have 4 or 5 of those on the schedule. If you want to be a bowl team, you probably got to win most of those or 3 of 5 or whatever it is, depending on how you look at it. And we always play these because this is the most fun game to play right now when it's June. But like you were kind of hinting at, then you get into November and a team might be down a quarterback or, Syracuse played NC State, for example, at home last year. And that was a game I don't even think Syracuse played very well, and they still won the game technically against an NC State team that was on paper pretty good at the time, but they were playing without their starting quarterback and a number of injuries. And that was sort of before NC State started to slide a little bit towards the end of the season. So that's just an example of if we were looking at the schedule in June, you would have said, oh man, that's going to be a tough game. No way they end up going 6-0 and actually win that one too. But it ended up being an easier game than we thought. So I think how Syracuse closes this season is going to be the most interesting thing from a perspective of how do they evaluate how the season went and where they want to go from here with Dino Babers, because it's been well documented. John Wildhack said, the athletic director, just a couple of days ago, that he does have multiple years still left on his contract. They're not going to come out and say exactly what it is, but I think most Syracuse fans are under the assumption there's 2 years left on his deal. And Pete Thamel has done some good reporting on the buyout numbers in previous years when fans were getting a little agitated. Well, now after this year, you're probably getting to a lower buyout number with just 1 more year in theory is what we think is still left on the deal. So all that's to say that I think the thing that Dino Babers has to prove to the Syracuse fans is that he can end the season strong. His teams can get better as the season progresses, sort of trademarks of good coaching and having teams that are built for the long run, which you need in college football, and they haven't necessarily done that. So at least the schedule on paper this year seems like it might be a little more beneficial for them to be able to do that.
So Tim, considering your position, I won't ask you anything else regarding what we just discussed. But I will say this, that you just ran a red flag up the pole for me. So, I mean, I've been around long enough to read stuff. So I'm just saying that I
know nothing, but I think that's just sort of the fans' perspective on the whole thing, right?
That's what we're going to end with right there. It's the fans' perspective. That's a fair way of looking at it. Hey, our special guest has been Tim Leonard, the pre and post game host and sideline reporter for Syracuse football. We're talking Syracuse and how they look on offense, defense, special teams, and much more. And Tim, thank you so much. This is your inaugural year. I hope you have a great time doing it and you enjoy yourself immensely.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Hopefully we get some good games. That Yankee Stadium game will be fun for sure. Clemson at home. There's going to be some big crowds at the very least. So thanks for having me, guys. Really enjoyed this.
Our pleasure.
Thanks, Tim.